Welcome, everybody, to the Polaris Connection, a podcast for parents and families of autistic and neurodivergent children. Today, we are joined with Dr. Maylin Griffiths, a licensed clinical psychologist with a deep passion for supporting children and families. She's a graduate of Arizona State University with a bachelor's degree and also a doctorate from the California School of Professional Psychology. Dr. Griffiths brings an extensive expertise in conducting comprehensive assessments for children in a wide range of settings, from qualifying for disability services related to autism and intellectual disability, to facilitating independent educational evaluations and coordinating treatments across multiple providers. Her work spans serious mental health conditions and learning differences, always with a goal of helping children receive the care and support they need. We are honored to have her. Dr. Griffiths, welcome to the show today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
And I forgot to introduce my co-host, Nathan Palmer, the great assessor himself.
You don't need to introduce me. I just insert myself when appropriate. Glad to be here. And I love listening to these bios because, can I call you Maylin or do I need to do Dr. Griffiths? Some people are
first names.
Wonderful. I think it makes it more personal. I love, Maylin, your bio because it speaks to how much you care about the kids. It was less professional and more heart forward. So we are just glad to have you on the podcast with us today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here and talk with you guys more. We absolutely love Polaris, and I want to hear more about you guys too and share a little bit more about what we do.
Well, wonderful. Maylin, we're so grateful to have you. I need to ask you, on your bio, you have a superpower, and you list this on your website, and it says your superpower is seeing the good in every kid with a core belief that there is no such thing as a bad kid. Where does this superpower come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think I get to talk to parents when they're at their most frustrated most days. And so sometimes when I talk with teachers or principals or parents, sometimes what comes through is I'm having a hard time seeing the good in this kid. And I have been doing this for so many years and I've yet to see a bad kid. And so I think if we can reframe what's the struggle, where they're hard, where we're about to give up, and really understand there's good in this kid, there's good in every kid. And we just need to flip it. We got to flip the script a little bit so we understand what their strengths are. And then we can also help those strengths outshine that part that's making it hard for us to see. And so I always lead with this philosophy that there's no such thing as a bad kid. You can't convince me of it. I've worked with some scary kids that needed a lot of support for sure. But even in those kids in those moments, there's good in everyone. And I think it's our job to really help bring that out of them.
Wow, that's wonderful. Where does your passion come from with working with these children? Again, you work with a lot of broad base. Why do you do what you do, and how come you enjoy it so much?
Yeah. I've told this story a few times, but not many people know it. When I grew up, I was going to be a pediatrician. That was it. You couldn't convince me otherwise. I used to fake being sick so I could go hang with a pediatrician all day. It was my favorite thing to do. I knew that's what I was going to be. Started out at U of A med program,
so
and I was med
school
all the way.
Getting on the job training already.
I know. Oh yeah. My parents would be like, again? And I was like, come on, we got to go hang with them. And it was the best. Dr. Deerdorf, he retired, but he was in Mesa and he was amazing. And he let me shadow him too. So I'm doing pre-med and I need volunteer work. So I sign up for Big Brother, Big Sister. This is in Tucson. I get paired with a little girl and I go pick her up and her tennis shoes are tied to her ceiling fan and she can't go to school because she doesn't have shoes. When I come to find out that her brothers have been taking her books and throwing them away and just putting all these obstacles in her way for being successful. And so I started buying her shoes and getting her books and picking her up and taking her to school. And on that route to school, she would share with me these struggles that she was having. And it was literally in those moments where I was like, oh, I don't want to be a doctor of the bones. I want to be helpful with the brain and helpful with supports and helpful with this kind of mental component. So I signed up for a Psych 101 class and fell in love with the idea that we can better understand people, their behaviors, their motives. Fast forward to working in a residential unit in San Diego. I took a postdoc fellowship on a whim and was in charge of 65 kids that lived at the San Diego Center for Children. They were all kids who were state kids who had been unsuccessful in foster placements. And I was in charge of 65 of them. And they all lived in these little cottages, and not a single kid had an IEP. Most kids had a diagnosis of bipolar and were prescribed lithium or Abilify. And we were managing behaviors at that point. It was restraints and holds and runaways. That's what the whole place consisted of. And I said, what if I could get a grant? So we got a $2 million grant to do an assessment clinic. And I thought, well, we got to know more about these kids. So we did 65 assessments in 1 year, and we got 63 IEPs in 1 year. And 2 of the kids didn't need them. And the 63 kids were supported in their schools better. They had specialized training. We understood which kids had learning disabilities, which kids were from significant trauma. We better understood kids who had intellectual disabilities. We were better able to see and diagnose autism. So through the assessments, we could better provide a lot of treatment for these kids and interventions and supports. And so from there, it kind of got me on this kick of like, every kid needs an assessment. And how do we make our assessment plans set these kids up for success with resources?
So that's interesting. I mean, you talk about the blessing of giving an assessment. I can tell you from a parent perspective, and I've heard this from other parents, sometimes it's a little scary, the idea that our child is going to get a label, or that, we're going to hear something maybe that we don't want to hear. And so sometimes we think, no, let's just leave them integrated in this, normal or typical environment, rather than discovering this scary thing that an assessment might bring on. Can you speak to that? Have you seen that in some of your parent interactions?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we're not really about labels either. I always tell most of our teen kids, like, you're not going to walk out with a T-shirt that says, I have blank, right? We don't hand those out. But what I find is if we're just 1 degree off for year after year after year, we get so far off track. I cannot tell you the amount of kids that we see that came in with our thoughts that, oh, it's this, and we uncover with the data, no, it was actually this, and we better understand. One of the diagnoses labels that gets tossed around on a lot of kids is ODD. Not quite sure we even really believe in ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. I like to know what's fueling the ODD. Sure, a kid might be oppositional, but what's creating the opposition? And so if we have this core belief, 2 beliefs, every kid is a good kid, and I'm always curious about behaviors, that opens me up to a lot more possibilities. Potentially they're acting out in class because they don't understand what's going on. Potentially they're acting out in class because they had some really negative peer interactions on the way into school that have really upset them. Potentially they're acting out because the sensory environment is so overwhelming that it's their body's way of reacting to it. So I think if we get more curious about the why, we can better understand what's going on. Now, if that leads to a label, let's flip that. Instead of a negative thing, now we've opened up a huge door for resources. How do we better help using that, diagnosis or that thing that we're going to call it? How do we better help to support? Even calling it something doesn't change what's happening. It just helps us to better understand it and have a common language.
Yeah, and I love that. I get feedback sometimes in this field that, hey, we're assessing to seek a diagnosis. We're assessing because it's a profitable industry, right? But to hear you speak of this, no, it's an opportunity. It's a deep dive. It's a more comprehensive. We're not just a specialist at assessing this one thing. Bring us your kid and we're going to deliver you a diagnosis for services. It's really this. Let's discover the underlying. And so I love your approach. It's why. And it's why we refer your clinic so frequently to parents looking for support, because I love your mission and I love your approach. Really, it's about discovery versus just giving us that diagnosis almost at a, hey, here's a clinical service level, versus let's discover what your child's all about.
Yeah, we're definitely not the right fit for every family, and we're not the right fit for somebody who's just seeking a diagnosis. That's why actually I do all of our intake screening calls. So I do about 30, 15-minute consults every single week. And sometimes it gets exhausting, but it really helps us to be able to connect with families and make sure we're the right fit and they're the right fit for us. If a family's just needing that diagnosis, there's a lot of other places and providers. It's just not us. We're not just spot checking for ADHD or just in dyslexia or just this, we really want to comprehensively see everything about that kid. What are their strengths? What are their concerns? And there are cases where we say, a diagnosis doesn't really fit. That doesn't make sense, but that doesn't mean we're not going to roll out a huge plan to support them. And families that work with us just have to be open to the idea that you may not leave here with a diagnosis. And if that's the only only thing that you're looking for, then we're probably not the best fit.
Well, so I know a lot of parents, so I like what you're saying to talk about the curious of the why, and it's an opportunity, discovery. When should a parent, what would you tell a parent if they need to get their child assessed or not? How do I know if I need to do that or if I don't need to do it?
Yeah, that question came up so much that I actually created a 5-question quiz on our website that says, does my child need an assessment? And it kind of rolls through those options for families, but I'll kind of roll through with you because I created it.
And so I don't miss this opportunity, Maylin. What is your website so that if parents want to go through that as a resource, where can they go find that? And so I didn't mean to cut you off, but I want to capture that there is a resource. What is it?
Yeah, so azassessment.com is where you'll find all of the things that you need. But so on that front homepage, there's like, do we need an assessment? And really the things we're checking in on, and there's an option for it to be no. So just so you know, it doesn't always mean to yes. So
and we're going to put all that information on
yeah.
the show notes after this podcast, so our families can know where to find you.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. So if you're getting feedback from like a family friends, from, what you're looking at, from your pediatrician about development. So let's start very early development. So we're talking about walking, talking, social interaction. I'm thinking that kind of like before 4, 5 kind of time period. So you're at the park and you're noticing that, gosh, my kid's just not playing with the other kids like I am seeing the other kids play. I'm hearing my nieces and nephews have these sentences they're stringing together and my child's not. I am a little bit concerned with different behaviors. So anytime it kind of feels off, it's a good check-in for developmental assessment. Then most of our kids will enter some type of either homeschool, micro school, public school, charter school, things like that. I want you to be listening to teacher feedback when you go to those conferences, when the teacher's reaching out to you. What kind of common themes are they saying? What are you hearing? Are you working really well with the teacher where you're in the classroom to be able to observe it? You're asking questions about their social, their behavior, pieces where you're just taking and collecting information. And then the other part of it is working within a team. So a lot of times our kids will come to us when what traditionally should work isn't working. We've been in therapy for 6 months. We've tried these medications. We put these tutoring things in place. What we would think traditionally would work for most kids is not working. And so that's where the assessment can be really helpful to figure out, well, where did we get off, or where did we miss it, or where are we not quite connecting the right dots, and then help get on the right track.
So if all the parents that would say, hey, I want to get my child diagnosed or I want them to be assessed, what would be the ratio if you had like 100 parents, of those parents and you see those kids, how many of them walk away with any kind of diagnosis?
Yeah. And remember, so we wouldn't be a good fit for someone saying, I want a diagnosis. We're interested in parents who are curious about their kid. Yeah, curious about how their kid's doing and functioning and supporting them. So if you took a jar with water and oil and you shook it, and that's the community, we're getting the top, right? We're getting the parents that have heard they're concerned, the teacher's concerned, they're noticing the kids are behaving a little bit differently than other kids. And so I'm not getting the whole community, right? I'm getting that top kind of level of the kids who already people are saying they're concerned. Now we've done the screening process where you have to go on our website and schedule a consult call. So now you have to be interested enough to accept a call from me that you scheduled. So now I'm getting those kids. Now you've had a 15-minute call with me and we've flushed through a lot. We've talked a lot about what we think could be community resources or other resources. Oftentimes on those 15-minute calls, I'm spending a lot of time going, hey, check out this therapist instead. Why don't you call this speech person? Have you checked with Polaris for their admission? So we're not just saying, it's not a sales pitch of like, come to us. It's really like, for our under 5 kids, I usually always say, go to AZ, Arizona Early Intervention Program. Like we can do those resources. So now we've taken those 15-minute phone calls and we've either siphoned those maybe in half to say, well, who could access community resources and who do we think still needs an assessment? And then from those families, we're scheduling them in within about 2 weeks or so to get through that process. So when I give you my numbers, our numbers are really subjective of that very small kind of subset of kids. It's not like a community sample. And I would say it's probably about 80-20. So about 80% of our kids were very nicely going, oh, yeah, if we called it this, this would make a lot of sense. And I'd say about 20% of our kids were saying, let's watch, let's keep an eye on them. This is really early. We're going to monitor it. Or, hey, I think if we made some shifts here, let's shift a little bit of our parenting strategy. Hey, let's go check in on some holistic stuff. Hey, let's cut down on screen time and junk food and then come back in a little bit, So I think that there's some different modifications that we can make that don't always result in a diagnosis, but keep in mind that 80% that I say isn't like I'm grabbing 100 kids from the community. They're really kind of a subsection of that community population.
I like how you're working with the parents with the child to say, hey, maybe we need to cut back on these few things and then reassess. Maybe we need to do a few little things here and then maybe we reassess. Does that happen quite often or once in a while?
Yeah. Well, so our assessments are over 3 weeks. So we get a 3-week chunk of time and usually 2 weeks from our phone call, then the 3-week process. So within, I'd say, a month. And usually on that first phone call, I'll say something like, let's collect some data while we're waiting to get to see you. Let's cut out screen time and let's cut out, these types of foods for a little bit. And when we come back, let's check in and see how that went for a little bit.
Is that true with all assessments for diagnosing like any kind of disorder? Is it always a 3-week process or is that something that your clinic does?
It's sort of a refined process after doing this for so many years that works for us in a way that really allows us to be very in-depth, but also quick. I think there's probably a lot of movement in how other people do it. It's just been our system. For example, some places will do the intake with the kid in the room right before they assess. I have problems with talking about a kid's struggles openly with their parent when the kid's in the room and then me going, no, it's the IQ test, right? Like that just seems like not the best strategy. So we also like to be very prepared. So we put a week in between when we do that parent meeting without a kid present, just our parent time, about a week time. So we can prep. I can get the MET meeting. I can review the IEP. I can collect data from the therapist. I can check in with consents for the teacher. So and by the time I see that kid for the assessment, we're like ready to hit the ground running. We've got a plan. We know what we're looking for. I've read the records. I know what we're doing.
Oh, that's pretty nice. I like how comprehensive and how much time you put in every one of these assessments. That's probably why you're so good and so popular about it. With another thing, Nathan mentioned about labeling real quick. And I know parents struggle with that with their kids. Let's say if I would take my child to your clinic and they get an assessment and they come away with some type of diagnosis. Does that diagnosis stay with them for the rest of their life? That's like on some government website that they have to disclose in all forms. I guess some people worry about how do we use these diagnoses? Is it always going to be that label with that child for the rest of their life?
You're asking a good question. And it's actually one because I know our process. I hadn't really thought of, but I've been hearing a lot from parents. So I do think it's an important question to address because it's private practice. This is the parents' information. Essentially, they're given the information and they can do what they want with it. I always tell parents, if you want to go home and shred the assessment and pretend like you never met with us, that's your free will to do that. We're not reporting anything to anyone anywhere. And so it's really how they want to use that support. We don't bill insurance if you don't want to. So we allow families to take a super bill and turn it into their insurance. And we'll even give families super bills with a diagnosis code and without. So they're free to do that without it. But there's no like registry that we report to, which is the most beautiful thing about being in a private practice. Actually, part of our consent forms, families have to initial saying, you understand in no way will we ever engage with any third parties ever. And also our services are confidential, which means that we are legally bound to not pretend like we don't know you if we see you out in public. And I'll tell families this too, like we'll see you on the soccer fields and at Target and Costco. You go about your business and pretend like we've never met. And that is very okay. It's confidential that we know each other, that we're working together. And the families get a full copy of the assessment electronically and paper when they leave, and they're free to do what they'd like with it, whether they choose to share it to the school or give to their pediatrician or share with the therapist. Obviously, we'll facilitate that if they ask us to, but it's their free will to do what they'd like with it.
Well, Maylin, God bless you. I bet you Christmas parties are exciting and also stressful at the same time.
say I tell people that I do nails for a living, and then not a lot of people have follow-up questions on that. So it's my trick. If anyone's needing a trick on what to do, I can't think of a single question I would ask someone that does nails. So it's my secret. It's my Christmas party job that I tell people.
On the one side, I appreciate the confidentiality, right? It gives parents a sense of control with the information, right? And I think that's part of alleviating some of that anxiety. But I just want to throw out there for those listening, getting a diagnosis in this case is different than like diagnosing a disease. And I say that just because a lot of times, and maybe I'm just speaking from my own, but I have to feel like I'm echoing some other parent sentiment out there. We feel like we're going into this and I'm waiting for you to tell me what's wrong with my kid. Like the diagnosis means they have some condition, something we have to fix or treat. And really, Maylin, just from my interactions with you and the more I'm hearing you talk, it's not about identifying the problem so much as learning more about the unique dynamics of your child, the label or diagnosis, if you want to call it that, or even just the information that's extracted from the assessment is an opportunity to be a better parent, to provide better guidance, and to get to know their specific and unique needs, their strengths. And so just for parents listening that have the same hesitation that I did, coming out of this, I think is more empowering than it is limiting. And once you get that deep dive in on the other side of an assessment, is liberating more than it is scary. So for those that are like considering, do I do this? Do I pursue? Just from a parent side, knowledge is power, and it's more freeing than it is debilitating.
I appreciate hearing that too. Yeah, I think that's our perspective. I know one of the questions that you also asked was like, is the diagnosis forever? And I think just to answer that one too, it kind of depends. So a lot of times what we see is, let's just toss out some diagnoses, autism, and then we might see a lot of depression and a lot of anxiety. And so what we know for some of these kids is they've been in an environment, let's say a mainstream school setting, 30 kids, lots of sensory overload, not quite fitting in or making friends, lots of social isolation. And so we've got these overlapping things that are going on for these kids. And that is all very temporary until we put them in the right environment. Let's say we move a kid out of a mainstream classroom and we get them a more specialized supports and we get more sensory regulation. We put some more different type of friendship clubs on things that they're interested in, connecting with same peers, peer interest. Now, all of a sudden, that low mood, that anxiety, that irritability, the withdrawal, all that stuff sort of fades away. So I think in sometimes the label, the diagnosis can be very, situational or environmental. And that's part of our job too, is to help explain that to parents. What you're seeing right now is likely a result of the environment, and we can make a lot of changes with that in a positive direction.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean, it kind of shows why at Polaris we're trying so hard to have these kids in the right environment, kind of help them, guide them through this process. That's interesting. So would you say on these assessments, and I don't know if you can answer this, that you make a really good point. How much of their environment would you say impacts the results of the assessment? Meaning like the environment that they're going through right now. Like I don't know if it's even to the point of, okay, parents are getting a divorce and that's a very stressful time on everybody's life. Some type of trauma, how much does that play in the assessments, and is there like a curve to it?
Yeah, so here's my thoughts, just to me. I don't know that I'd want someone making judgments about my IQ if I was in a current state of crisis, if my whole world was falling apart and the ground underneath me was not stable and everything was chaotic. I think what we're doing in those moments is making a judgment on what this kid looks like right now, because there's so much turmoil. That's why I do a lot of those 15-minute calls, because I'll hear from families and I'll say, I don't know that an assessment is the best thing right now. I think maybe getting stabilized with therapy, getting in the right school setting, let's get things a little bit calm for the moment. And then we can figure out, and all that kind of is guided by what our goal is for the assessment, right? Now, there might be some times where a family's going, do we need to hospitalize? Do we need residential? Can I keep this kid in my home? Do I need guardianship? And I go, oh gosh, we got to see this kid right now. We're making right now decisions. So we need a right now assessment. So I think it kind of depends on what the referral is, but I absolutely think environment can play into what's presenting. And now we're talking more about what's my question? What's the need for the assessment?
And that brings up a good curiosity on my side, Maylin. And maybe this is helpful for parents in general. It sounds like I mean, the assessment's a snapshot, right? You're doing a lot of prep, you're getting a lot of information, you're targeting specific questions and maybe specific. I know there's various types of assessments you do based on concerns and some of that input data, and that gives you this snapshot of your child today, and here's a deep dive into who they are. Do those change over time? In other words, if a parent came back a year later, maybe after they've done some of these accommodations or after they've input some of these supports, do you guys recommend, or is it a thing that you do, ongoing assessments to see change over time because those assessments are hard to have access to? Or is it really just, hey, this is an initial, and then we then turn them over to others for follow-up supports after that point? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does a lot. Yeah. And not to get in the nitty gritty of it, but what we're really looking for is three big domains to start with: cognitive functioning, actual age level functioning, and then learning. What we think is cognition is relatively stable outside of like a big crisis, huge environmental thing. Our cognition is pretty cemented, about 6 to 8. We have a pretty solid idea of where we are cognitively. What we would expect for every person is where you cognitively are, IQ, brain, that's where you're going to be functioning. That's where you'll be communicating, socializing, daily living skills, coping skills. And then that should also match up with where you're learning: reading, writing, math. It should all lay on top of each other if we kind of put it on a curve. For most of the kids we see, those things don't. They're spread out. Where they could be functioning because of their cognition and where they actually are functioning are very different, meaning they're struggling socially, they're struggling with doing daily living skills, they're struggling with coping, their learning is struggling. So what we want to do is put interventions on anything that's away from their potential and then watch the progress for it. So we think about a year or 2 years. Now I want to see, well, is your actual functioning matching up to where we know you cognitively should be? Is your socializing, is your coping, is your taking care of yourself, your hygiene, your sensory regulation, is all of that moving in a positive direction now that we put some interventions in place?
So that, I love that. I remember in physics class learning about kinetic energy versus potential energy. Kinetic is the actual, potential is, hey, it's positioned and it has this potential for this energy. And what I love about what I'm hearing you saying is, yeah, maybe it's a snapshot, but you're actually diving into, here's where they are, here's where they could be, and you're giving this roadmap to their kids' potential. I almost kind of want to brand you like you're unlocking a child's potential through the assessment. We're not seeking a diagnosis or a label. We are seeking how much potential energy does my kid have, and giving a roadmap. That by itself, I think, should excite a lot of parents about the process versus this fear of the label.
Yeah, you need to change your job title to the child's potential.
The Potential Energy Center.
Yeah. I'm on it.
We like to brand on our show. I don't know if you listen to past.
Every show we come up with a new brand, and it's fun how we find. Yes. So
I needed more to do. Thank you. That's a good idea. Thanks.
You say, listen, I'm your child's potential professional. That's what I do.
And what I want to reassure families with too is that it's not all heavy on one person. So I think some people get nervous, like they're going to tell me 100 things I have to do. And I might tell you a few things, but really it's multimodal, multi-environment, multi-person. So there's things that parents can do, teachers can do, schools can do, the environment can do, things working with therapists. So the other feedback I get a lot of questions on is, are you just going to tell me to put my kids on medication? And I think there's some utility in medications, but that's usually always our very last suggestion. So we always want to come at it from an environmental strategy, and that can be home, school, community. That's 3 huge pieces right there. Then we want to come at it from our connection and our interaction. So our parenting connection, sibling connection, friend connection, therapist connection. Well, that's huge right there already. So now we've done these huge modifications in the environment with just these pillars. And then lastly, when things are so high, we can't turn the volume down. We need some help and support, really being able to provide families with that alternative option, which might be medications, with the goal of reducing things so that I can take advantage of the environment and the connection and the supports that are around me. But that's not always the first line of defense, especially from our lens.
I think that's just a good advice for everybody in general. It's like if you're struggling with any kind of trauma or thing, I guess anything with your life, like look at your environment, make sure we're making good connections. And before you do any kind of drugs, make sure that you're good on that side. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, there's that stigma out there. Listen, I am by no means a clinician. Doctor is nowhere near my title. I got to Juris Doctorate with law, but that has nothing to do with this field. But just observationally, I kind of see there's 4 main areas of dysregulation, and Maylin, if I'm way off, I apologize, but this is just from my observational experience.
Hear it.
You kind of see, there's emotional dysregulation. We can see environmental sensory, which is kind of just the environment we're in. Sometimes it's behavioral dysregulation, right? Which is where some of that ABA and programming and social developmental data-driven efforts come in. But sometimes there is just legitimate chemical dysregulation. And again, just getting clarity on what it is so that we can better approach. You can't fix chemical through environmental, and you can't fix environmental through chemical. So just, again, having that clarity is so helpful in giving our kids what they need versus what we think they need.
But the part of it is that there's no solution that doesn't require work. So I think that's really important. So if I'm going to change up my parenting, that's going to be work. If I'm going to do a new school system, that's going to be work. If I'm going to try a therapy, that's going to be work. If I'm going to try a medication, I think that sometimes gets branded as the easiest option and not quite understanding that's going to be work too, because we're not always going to just take one thing to fix it. It's going to take work. So there's no easy solution. All of them will take work. And I really want to caution families sometimes when they think, well, the medication's the easiest solution, because it's not. It's just as much work as the other ones are.
Sure. No, and I appreciate that. That's great insight. One question I get a lot on the school side, especially to families new to the space that aren't familiar with some of the supports, like maybe even just in a traditional public school setting, I get asked all the time, what's the difference between an IEP and a 504, and what does that mean for my kid? Could you shed some light on that just in an instructional basis so our parents know what these things are rather than the word salad acronyms we tend to just throw out at them?
Sure. I'd prefer not to be quoted on this because I feel like it changes so much and every district is like, that's not what we said. Okay, so my best understanding is that a 504 is accommodations to the environment. So I'm accommodating things with the environment. So let's think about a child who might be in a wheelchair. I'm going to accommodate the environment by installing a ramp for this child. Let's think of a kid who might struggle with attention and focus. I'm going to accommodate the environment by putting them up in the front of the class. I'm going to add things into the environment, fidget toys, wiggle seats, things like that. I might even be able to accommodate the environment by putting them in a smaller room to do testing with less distractions, right? So I've accommodated the environment. An IEP is individualizing that child's education. So now what we're saying is that whatever's going on with this child is adversely affecting their ability to learn, and we need to change the way they are learning so that they can be successful. And that might include shorter tests, more time on a test than the other students do. Special resource pullout. So instead of learning the reading that the other kids in the mainstream class are learning, now we're learning reading in a different way, different format. So they're getting a different type of education. And there's a whole bunch of different eligibility reasons why a kid might need their education to be individualized. But anytime we switch from accommodating the environment to individualizing their education, we've now switched from a 504 to an IEP.
Perfect. Great description. Again, I'm not going to quote you on that. You are on our podcast, but I won't put quotation marks around it. But that's a great explanation. And I just want to put out there because it's hard to sometimes find those simple resource answers out there. And I thought you explained it perfectly.
Well, and here's where it gets confusing, though, because you can individualize a kid's accommodation or individualize their academics and add in accommodations. So for some IEPs, we might add accommodations to it. So that's where the kind of like the nitty gritty nuances of it. For most kids who have an IEP, we also have an accommodation page that further confuse us. Oh, and the best part, for the schools, the IEP team and the 504 team are two separate people. So you can't have one meeting to decide this. You have to have separate meetings to decide if it's an IEP or a 504, and those people don't talk either. So you can't have cross talk with those.
Can we make it more complicated?
No sense.
I'm trying to contain myself from like blowing up in frustration as to why we built Polaris and why we're approaching so different. And it's funny, Maylin, because I hear you describe the intent of them, right? From a purist standpoint, the intent of a 504 and the intent of an IEP are pure and they're good and they're wonderful. But then the reality is you go to in this environment where there's one teacher and 30 kids and 3 have IEPs, and the reality of really executing the intent of those plans is so difficult. And the red tape associated with it, almost like we started with these good intent and we regulated it so far that the execution just turns into a nightmare, and you need to hire advocates and people just to support it. So I'm going to get off my soapbox for a second. I'm glad that there's good-hearted people like you out there educating and helping. But you're right. It's a hard problem to solve. And in figuring out how do we individualize it? How do we support? How do we accommodate? Just to loop back, assessments like what you do and insights that you provide shine a light on it so we can better approach and better target those specific intervention needs.
Absolutely. And we have found that that conversation is very different when parents are by themselves and when we are with them. And so that's why we go to all 504 and IEP meetings with all of our families. We don't charge anything extra for that. It's just part of getting the process done in the right way. When I hear from parents what happens in those meetings when we're not there, I'm like, wow, that's wild. And then we show up to those meetings and the tone is quite different. And I think it's unfortunate that a lot of families need that extra support, but it's just one that in our experience, those meetings go a lot better when parents have someone going, oh no, this is, this acronym means this, and this is what they're saying. This, and that's why we have to have this meeting, like just stopping and explaining it a little bit. So as just a rule of thumb, we go to all those meetings with our families just to help them out.
And what a great resource you are to help advocate for some of these parents, because I know that as a parent, sometimes I just don't know what I don't know. I think I come with good intentions, but sometimes I just don't know, and I want to help out our kids as best as we can.
And Brad, if I could just jump in, just to clarify, I have nothing but love and support for our public school system. The more we've done this journey with Polaris and a unique approach to education and meeting our teachers and seeing how much heart and soul they pour into what they do, I don't mean to demean any of them in the process, but it is just such a big ask to take these educators that are given this charge to educate everybody universally, and then on top of that, hyper specialized with so many unique accommodations. It's almost like we're putting in a position to fail, and those frustrations just come out in those settings. So I don't mean to speak bad about the people. I love educators and their purpose and their mission. I just think sometimes, and it's why I love school choice and what Arizona's done in pioneering that, sometimes we need a different path. And so it's nice that parents have those options and choices out there.
Yeah, we echo that. I mean, I can't tell you the sigh of relief we see on teachers' faces when we walk into those meetings or see a kid in the classroom observation or get a teacher feedback. They're like, please, help, this kid needs help. I need resources. And so I mean, I have yet, as I haven't met a bad kid, I've yet to meet a teacher who didn't have good intentions and wanted the best for their students. It's just getting them the right supports to be able to thrive in their classroom.
Yeah. Well, and let me ask you this. Your assessment seems very thorough. It's almost like a 3-week process. What is the difference from what you understand, the best you can explain? If I'm a parent and I want to have my child go through an assessment, what's the difference of what you do in a private company, what they would experience in a public school setting?
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot. And so I think that's why I like to explain the difference. And as I mentioned, we're not the right fit for everyone. So there might be some times where I say, and I often say hey, did you ask the school for help yet? Have you checked in on an assessment with the school yet? What was the response when you asked the school to do the assessment? So that's usually something that we start with. Schools are not allowed to provide a medical or clinical diagnosis. So they provide eligibility for academic services. So eligibility for an IEP, for example. They also use different words. So while we might call something ADHD, they use the eligibility of other health impairment. Oftentimes when families are wanting to take other health impairment to community resources, people don't know what they're talking about. So our assessments will combine both of those, medical clinical diagnosis as well as the IEP eligibility we think they should be eligible for. And then a lot of our families are using ESA funding to provide a different type of education for their children. And so we'll be able to give the medical clinical diagnosis versus just did they meet the academic eligibility to help qualify for those ESA funds for the right school program. So
Gotcha.
that's one of the differences is that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So just to be clear, so you schools give more of an eligibility assessment. It's not really, are you saying they don't do a diagnosis? It's more of an eligibility of a potential diagnosis?
That's correct. They're not allowed to give a diagnosis or a medical clinical diagnosis.
That's
They're
good
only
to
allowed
know.
to tell you if your child's eligible for an IEP based on the IEP criteria, which means their symptoms, let's call it, or their things that they're struggling with have to adversely affect their education. We have a lot of families who these kids do really well holding it together in school. They might be really bright kids too, so they can academically do well. But when we look at their adaptive functioning, social functioning, sensory integration, those things are all the big struggle, but academically they look just fine. So they wouldn't qualify for any services, which means, we don't have any information. So that's kind of the difference in the clinical medical outside of school piece of it. And then we can also take what we find and push it into schools.
So then if they go to your clinic and they are, is it fair to say that they're clinically diagnosed with autism, or with the school, they would be eligible for autism services, if I'm saying that correctly, and to
You
where
got
in
it.
your
Look at that.
clinic, they would be
Yeah.
diagnosed as autism. So then with those two different pages as a parent, what gives me the more options of resources? Is it better from a public school, or is it better from a private institution like yourself?
So our goal is to open as many doors for families as we can. For example, some families will access DDD services, which allows them to use speech and OT and different types of insurance. And you'll need a medical clinical diagnosis for that. So that would be a private assessment. For some pediatricians, psychiatrists, they're not going to look at an IEP eligibility before they consult on those things. So they'll use a medical clinical diagnosis for that. ESA funding. There are some families so autism-like is one of the categories that an IEP would need. And if they don't have that on their IEP, then they won't qualify for those ESA funds, where if they have the medical clinical diagnosis, they will. So, I mean, I think what our goal is to open as many doors as possible for families. And it's not to say that the IEP eligibility isn't an option for some families, and especially like maybe some learning disabilities too, where we say, well, has the school done any school testing for learning differences? Sometimes we hear, well, they're so many months out, or they refuse to do the testing. I mean, we get that often. They refuse to do the testing. And so when we test and we go, well, this is clearly a learning disability. And so if it's a good fit and we're a good fit and they're a good fit, there'd be no reason to refuse to do testing. We don't have any of those constraints that the school district has.
Well, and that's what I like what you guys are doing. It sounds like you're providing ongoing support with these parents. So if they do an assessment, it sounds like you're kind of reassessing them every so often. Is that correct? Or how often would you meet with the kid to redo another assessment?
About 50-50. So about 50% of our kids we set up with supports and they're on their way and we may not hear from them. And about 50% of the kids come back for a reassessment in a few years, or we might see their siblings. So I get to check in and see with the parents, like, how are they doing, and catch up on with them. We don't like to reassess until there's at least enough time to put interventions in place. So my rule of thumb is at least a year, most often 2 years. So I want 2 years of solid intervention. And there's times, and I'm very honest with parents, they'll call after 3 months and say, we need a new evaluation. And I'll say, let's pull it up. Did we call that IEP meeting? Nope. Did we check in with a therapist? Nope. Have we gone to that parenting class? Nope. Did you buy any of those books that we had in the office that you could have taken with you? No, not yet. And I'll go, awesome. We don't need another assessment. We need to start cutting after that recommendation list. So let's just pick one thing. Obviously, that list was too overwhelming. Let's just do one thing. And then you call me back in 3 months and tell me how that one thing went. And then we'll do our two things. Or, hey, here's what I need. Instead of a new assessment, let's set up an IEP meeting and let's go meet with the school team and see if we can wrap around differently. We don't need another assessment. So I think it kind of depends. I'd say it's about 50-50.
Gotcha. And kind of circling back to what you do, a little bit different than what's available in the public school settings. I love how you said, I'm here to help open doors for parents and for kids. And it sounds like that. I mean, it's not like doing an assessment at a school is bad. It just might not open up enough doors for those kids and those families for resources that they might need down the road. Is that fair to say?
For sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And Maylin, just so we're clear on the doors, because on the surface, doors sound really good until you're a parent new to diagnosis and you're confronted with this hallway of 1,000 doors and you don't know which way to go. Do you guys kind of help, I guess, be a hub resource to say, hey, here are what those doors mean. Here's some ways you can go about obtaining it. Or do you just kind of, great, we've got the diagnosis, best of luck, and try to navigate this door process?
I mean, I like to treat people how I would want to be treated. I would never want someone to do that to me. Like, all right, here you go. Here's your shirt and your label. Get out of here, right? No way. Yeah. So, and I think it's so we get to know our families so well in that little 3-week time. So I know which families are like, I got it. You gave me the to-do list and I'm on it. Done, done, done. And I have some families who might say, tell me that again. Let me go home and digest this. And can I talk to you tomorrow? And absolutely. Hey, I want to check in with, my husband and my parents, and I want to digest all this. And then they're going to help me with these next few steps. And for sure. So I think everybody's on their own journey for how they process through those recommendations. And we're just kind of here. We'll match your energy, I suppose. And if we feel like your energy needs shifted in one way, we'll encourage you to, hey, we got to get on this, one of those things.
When I highlight that for a reason, because again, some of the anxiety, and this is just speaking personally, and maybe it was just a different era, different provider, but when we got our son's diagnosis for autism, it was lonely, disconcerting. And the only thing we got was, yep, they're on the spectrum and good luck. And it was like, okay, now we have to figure out what does this mean? What are the doors? Where do I even find the doors? And so just for parents out there, and the reason we have you on our podcast, Maylin, is because I love your involvement. I love your personal touch to it, that they're not alone, that you are a resource more than just here's a stamp and here's a label and we send you on your way.
And
that's different than what's out there. Because trust me, there are whole groups and organizations formed just for that purpose. How do I help parents with a new diagnosis? And I love that you're part of that mission and that journey.
Yeah. And I think I guess for me, that's a tricky line for us to navigate, because I'll share the other side of it. And even to caution parents who are listening, I never wanted anyone to walk away feeling like I was biased to give a diagnosis. So I'll give you some examples. There are some ADHD clinics near us who will miraculously diagnose ADHD, and then they have a 15-week program that you have to sign up for in order to get your results. We have some dyslexia centers that will only give you the results of the assessment if you agree to their 5-week dyslexia course. And I never ever wanted families to feel like they had incentive in providing a diagnosis. So now you're stuck with us. Now you do the ABA therapy with us. Now you do the speech therapy with us. We got you for OT. You're with us, right? I don't ever want anyone to walk away feeling like, well, it did this really fit because now they're offering all this like add-on kind of stuff. Like, when you go get coffee and they're like, what do you want next? What do you want next? They're like upsell, right? So I never wanted anyone to feel like this is a big thing to diagnose a kid because there's an upsell to it. That feels so gross to me. And so then the other part of it is I don't want people to feel like, all right, later, bye, we're all done here. So I think it was kind of navigating this process of really providing good community connections with people we know, we talk to, we trust, we've been there. I've seen your classrooms. I've toured your place multiple times. I've sat in that therapist's office. I've talked to that psychiatrist. I've gone to lunch with that, speech therapist. So I know ins and outs of how they run it. And when I hand you off to them, I don't have any incentive for doing that other than I think they're really quality providers. I think they're a really great school. I think they'd be a great fit for your family. And so it's kind of that navigating that piece where we don't want to just give you off and say we're done, but I also don't want you to feel like there's any incentive for us to keep you.
That's great. I'm going to ask you a question that maybe you have an opinion on. I'm not asking for specific data because it's something that a lot of people wonder about, but I'd love just your thoughts on it. You'd mentioned that you've kind of been in this field for about 2 decades, 20 years or so, right? And doing assessments. And there's been a lot of dialogue about the increased prevalence of autism in children, right? The rates they used to be lower 20 years ago. They're substantially higher today. Have you seen that? And what are your thoughts on that movement and that shift? Is that more our ability to identify? Is that us making autism itself a wider net that's capturing more? What's your read on autism as a kind of growing dynamic that's just becoming this larger part of our society?
Yeah, I think my first thought were the two differences in the words disability versus differences. And so I think maybe before, let's go 2013 with we had the diagnostic manual that changed in 2013, but it really captured the disability, the disorder, where we could have scores in the standard scores of 70 and below. And what we have a better understanding of now with more of a neuroaffirming lens is the word differences. So these other kids who might not have been diagnosed with autism show social differences, communication differences, sensory integration differences, repetitive behaviors, in a way that may not impact their functioning to a disordered or a disabled kind of way, but does impact their ability to navigate with friendships and social communication and get a job independently without extra coaching, and to have these living skills without any supports, to function in a mainstream classroom without any support. So really what we think of is, I think we did a great job before of capturing kids who were under the umbrella of a disability disorder, and now we're doing a much better job of really supporting, not labeling or diagnosing, but supporting a group of people who may have some neuro differences in those three categories: social, communication, behavioral, sensory integration pieces. While that includes a diagnosis of autism, I really think of it from a neuroaffirming lens as supporting them in a different way, and that diagnosis is still captured under that whole spectrum.
I love that.
I love it. Yeah, because that makes it sound a lot less like an epidemic and a lot more like a socially conscious community that is better serving our own population who have always been there.
Yeah, and my guess, this is a clinical guess, that those who were not diagnosed with autism probably had some secondary diagnosis of anxiety or depression that were being captured, because what was really going on in those differences wasn't correctly being talked about or scaffolded around or supported. So we were secondarily seeing a lot more of the mental health piece, things like depression, isolation, social withdrawal, anxiety, failure to launch, work anxiety, all that kind of cluster, the secondary stuff. But now that we have a much better way of capturing those differences, we're seeing a lot less of the secondary things that come from not correctly calling it what it is.
Yeah. Maylin, what a wonderful, I feel like we can talk all day. Like I know,
I was just looking at the time.
I walk away and I feel like I have more questions than answers, So
we'll do a part
thank
two.
you, Maylin. So we'll probably have to do a part two as we kind of wrap up our show. And I appreciate all your insight. I was just captivated of just everything. I've been writing all this stuff down. So thank you so much for sharing your insights, your expertise. As we walk away and as we kind of conclude, what are some advice that you would give parents that would want their kid to be assessed? They're going through an assessment, or before they do an assessment. What advice would you want to close with our audience?
I think kind of what we started with. I think curiosity is so important. I need parents to be curious. I need teachers to be curious. I need resource people to be curious about what's fueling this behavior, curious about what could be going on, curious about what I could be missing. I think when we have a closed mindset, this is a bad kid, or this is that, or this, we're set on what this is, it doesn't allow us to really look for all of our options for solutions. So leading with curiosity has always led me to great things. And I think that's the best way that families, teachers, administrators, therapists, all of us can approach any situation with. And that allows us to just gather more information. Once we get more information, because we started out with curiosity, we can come up with better solutions.
I love it. Lead with curiosity. That's another t-shirt. Everybody that comes to do your assessment, they should leave with that t-shirt. Lead with curiosity.
Yeah. Lead with curiosity, know your child's potential, know you have an advocate. I mean, everything you do, Maylin, I love it as a parent. I love it as a professional. I love it as a collaborator. I love it. You guys are awesome. We appreciate all that you offer and do for us in the community.
Thank you. And right back at you. We really love and appreciate all the things you guys have done for the kids that we've sent your way. We get nothing but incredible feedback from our family. So whenever I do an intake and they say my kid's at Polaris, I'm like, done. Good to know. Yeah. So we love all the things you guys have brought to the community too.
Well, thank you. On that note, we're going to wrap up our show. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Maylin, for being part of our show today. Thank you for making us part of your day. And now let's go and do some good.